The Eucharist and service. The sacrament of the Eucharist and the call to serve. The two are intrinsically intertwined with each other. In the Eucharist, Jesus gives of himself to us in that sacrament, giving us his body and his blood. And Jesus gives of himself even to the point of death on a cross. In receiving Jesus, and when we receive Jesus in the gift of the Eucharist, we are to allow Jesus to transform us more and more to the likeness of himself. Think about that. When we receive the gift of the Eucharist, we are receiving Jesus himself. And as Jesus enters into us, it leads us to become more and more like Jesus. And that more and more like Jesus means to live and to act as Jesus. It is to care for the poor, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked. And we might consider that, oh, well, that is a good thing to do, and we do it ever so often. Maybe we'll go on a run with mobile loaves and fish, or maybe we'll do a service project one time, and then that's it. But we remember what Jesus did, and it was always of service. And so we consider, how are we of service every day of our lives? Now, we can always see these big projects, so to speak, but the call to service starts at the home. The call to service is up to be one of another. And that comes about, that call to service, that ability to serve, it comes from the gift of the Eucharist. As we receive, it is to be transformed and cooperate with Jesus himself. In other words, as St. Augustine wrote, if we receive the Eucharist worthily, we become what we receive. Listen to that. If we receive the Eucharist worthily, we become what we receive. To become Christ to others. And that leads us to act accordingly. When we see the words of Jesus, when we read about him and reflect upon the life of Jesus, the words of Jesus are mirrored by his actions when he calls us to wash one another's feet. What Jesus is calling us to do is not just literally wash the feet of someone, but what Jesus is calling us to is calling us to love, calling us to serve, and calling us to forgive each other. That's the grace of the Eucharist transforming us into Christ. That we might love, serve, and forgive. And that gift of the Eucharist becomes a source of grace for us to love, to serve, and to forgive. See, the two cannot be separated. Communion at the table of the Lord cannot be separated from communion lived in washing each other's feet. To love, to serve, and to forgive. They're connected, they're intertwined intrinsically. You cannot separate the two. Because that is Christ. We're called to be Christ to one another. And we do that with the grace of Christ and the cooperation of our lives, of our wills to do that. We can make that decision to say, yes, no, I will not cooperate. But as we receive the gift of the Eucharist, it leads us to a response of love. A love we receive from Christ, and a love that we share. The love of Jesus we receive, and the love of Jesus we share. The Eucharist and service. The Eucharist and service, to receive and to share the love of Jesus. The Eucharist and service.